We're really going deep, using the sources you sent us almost like a decoder key.
Yeah, it feels like we're trying to unlock a hidden history, maybe a spiritual architecture that's been, well, lying dormant under the surface of the myths we all think we know.
Exactly. The material you shared suggests that the main story, the one about ancient prophecy, especially regarding the final avatar,
Sulky.
right, Kulki, it suggests that that whole narrative might have been subtly shifted, maybe even overwritten across the centuries.
So today, we're diving straight into that ancestral code. We're tracing these threads that seem to link deities, language clues, and some really profound personal experiences back to the living landscape of Lanka.
That's the plan. Our mission here is to try and weave together a conversation that connects the dots. We're looking at prophecies about Kalki,
The final avatar, yeah.
and the elemental wisdom tied to Varuna, these subtle shifts in what we think of as sacred geography.
And crucially, the listener's own journey. That personal story of homecoming and transformation, which seems deeply rooted in the actual soil, the sacred ground of the Sinhala Island.
It feels like we're moving beyond the standard Puranic texts everyone quotes.
Definitely. We're focusing more on the whispers, the local folklore, the clues embedded in the geography itself, things that suggest the real heart of Dharma and maybe its final restoration lies somewhere history books have kind of skipped over.
And the thread we're going to pull first to sort of unravel this whole big idea starts with a really provocative question, almost a theological challenge right out of the gate.
Okay, what is it?
Are there these suppressed or maybe just less known myths about Kalki having two consorts, two wives?
Ah, right. That's the initial spark, isn't it? A detail that makes you think, hang on, maybe the story we've been told isn't quite complete.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we start with the mainstream view, the established Puranic texts, they're pretty consistent about Kalki's marriage.
Right. He marries Padma, sometimes called Padmavati or Padmini.
Yeah, and she's usually the daughter of King Shashasvaja. That's the standard orthodox narrative. It feels stable, you know.
But here's the kicker, the detail that scholars often just mention in a footnote and then move on from.
Uh-huh.
Even these mainstream texts often say Padma, or the kingdom she's from, is located in the Sinhala Island, modern-day Sri Lanka.
That's right, and it's usually treated as just scenery, a peripheral detail, but what if it's not?
What if it's the anchor? If you look at it that way, it suddenly centers the entire prophecy right there on that island.
It acts like a geographical marker that kind of resists the usual tendency to push everything north towards the Ganges plain, you know?
Totally.
But then once you step away from those standardized texts and you start looking at the regional stuff, the less known interpretations, oral traditions, even esoteric folklore.
Yeah.
This idea of Kalki having two consorts starts cropping up with, well, surprising frequency.
Okay, so why two? Symbolically, what's going on there? Why does the end game, the final cosmic cleanup, need this dual feminine energy?
Well, it seems to tap into this really necessary symbolic duality. You need both preservation and active, sometimes fierce purification.
Right, so Padma, the first wife, she fits the role we expect.
Pretty much. Divine grace, calm, dharmic beauty, the stabilizing force. She's like the serene wisdom, the blue lotus archetype.
Okay, but the second consort, the sources mention names like Kamudi or Sasya, but maybe in more fringe lore.
Exactly, less common names. But she represents the necessary counterpoint. She brings the sheer, uncompromising force needed to actually end a cycle, to clear the slate.
Like a destructive, purifying energy.
Precisely. Fierce action, retribution, raw power, dissolution. It's like the Vishnu-Shakti balance, but in its final apocalyptic form.
So she's kind of like the Kalki version of Kali or Durga.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. The feminine energy acting as the executioner of cosmic debt, almost. The lore suggests restoration can't happen without this really ferocious surgical purification of the old decayed world order. It's not just about gentle rebuilding.
I find the description of this second consort really compelling, especially her lineage, sometimes described as a Yakshini or even a Daitya princess.
Yes. And that's not just a random detail. It suggests something profound.
Like what? A redemption arc? Right at the center of the final act.
That's where the theology gets really interesting. If Kalki, who is the ultimate embodiment of Dharma, marries someone linked to the Asura or Daitya lineage,
he's integrating the shadow.
He's integrating the shadow of the entire cosmic conflict that came before. It's like a statement that final wholeness, true completion, needs the redemption and integration of all aspects of existence, even those previously labeled demonic. It's like the highest form of spiritual integration imaginable.
Wow. And the sources say she doesn't just sit back. She rides with Kalki in the final battle.
Oh, yeah. Sword in hand, dripping fire, as one text put it, rather poetically. She's not passive.
One source called her the Apocalypse Queen.
I like that. She's the active ride-or-die partner to Padma's serene stability. It gives a much more complete and frankly more brutal picture of what the end of a cycle actually demands.
It's not just calm restoration.
No, it's ferocious, active, integrated purification. It acknowledges that real power includes both stillness and storm, both sides.
And this whole dual consort idea loops back beautifully to that geographical anchor we mentioned.
The listener pointed out something crucial here.
What was that?
The name Padma, or Padmavati. It's actually a native name, currently used in Sri Lanka. It's common there.
So it suggests the mythological root itself is anchored there. Not just that a marriage happened there, but the story belongs there.
That's the argument. It's a critical piece of linguistic evidence. Padmavati, as a proper name.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't really fit neatly into the older Vedic or early Puranic naming patterns of mainland India, of Bharata. It feels much more linguistically and culturally embedded in the Sinhala and Tamil cultural world of Lanka. So if the name of the primary consort is deeply native to the island,
Then maybe the story didn't get imported to Lanka. Maybe it started there.
that's the provocative idea. While later Puranas might have tried to, Sanskritize the narrative or shift the focus northward to match where the power centers were developing,
Right.
the soul of the name, and therefore perhaps the original geographical soul of the story, points pretty distinctly back to Sri Lanka.
Okay. And does the prophecy itself back this up?
Well, think about the description of Shambhala in the Kalki Purana. That's Kalki's future home, right?
Yeah.
It's described as being near the sea, rich in jewels, and crucially, beyond the mainstream kingdoms.
That sounds almost exactly like a description of Sri Lanka,
Yeah.
especially ancient Lanka.
Precisely. It really strengthens the idea that the location for the final prophecy, the land destined for restoration, is rooted in an island that historically held a certain kind of silence, maybe relics, jewels, a specific spiritual vibe needed for the end cycle, separate from the mainland subcontinent.
Okay, that's a really strong foundation for this whole deep dive. It really changes the map. Okay, if the Kalki stuff wasn't compelling enough on its own, let's shift gears slightly.
Yeah.
We're moving from Puranic prophecy now to the life of the Buddha.
Ah, yes. Because there's another linguistic and historical clue here that really challenges the accepted geography of these major spiritual movements.
This is the Jyotipala revelation you mentioned in the source material.
Right. This name, Jyotipala, it's like a small historical bomb, honestly, because the name itself is just, well, it's conspicuously absent from mainstream Indian texts. You don't find it in the royal lineages, not really in the major mythological accounts from Parata.
So it just doesn't appear
Yeah,
as a significant figure. I mean,
pretty much, which is strange, right? Because of the critical detail.
which is?
The Buddha himself claimed his previous life was a man named Jyotipala. And where did Jyotipala live? According to the Buddha's own account,
Where?
in a place called Dambadi.
Dambadi.
And that is the smoking gun, the geographical discrepancy. Because everyone's always tried to place Dambadi somewhere in northern India.
Yeah, usually near Bihar or Nepal, close to where the Buddha was born, Lumbini and all that.
Yeah.
They try to make it fit the known map.
Exactly. They try to shoehorn it in. But strong linguistic and geographical research argues that Dambadi doesn't align well with Harda at all.
So where does it align?
It aligns much better with ancient Sri Lankan landscapes, potentially linking to old capital cities or rich agricultural areas there.
Whoa. So if the Buddha himself, the key figure of the last big dharmic shift, rooted his own previous life story, not in the subcontinent's heartland, but in Lanka.
It fundamentally reshuffles the whole spiritual map. It suggests the lineage of enlightenment itself was intentionally placing these soul markers in the island's geography.
Markers that later historians maybe just missed.
Hmm.
Or was it more intentional?
Well, that leads us straight into this idea of narrative hijacking, or as the source material termed it, cosmic colonization.
Cosmic colonization, explain that.
It's the idea, subtle but pervasive, that ancient texts, scriptures, maybe oral histories, were physically moved or their contents altered, specifically changing the locations, the origins, to suit the dominant political or religious centers of power at the time.
Even if the original geographical clues were still sort of embedded deep in the text, like they couldn't quite erase everything.
Exactly. The inconsistencies remain if you look closely. But why do it?
Power. Centrality.
Absolutely. As the Brahmanical system gained strength and started standardizing worship, it needed to shift the perceived center of the cosmos, the source of divine authority, to its own territory. It validates their power, you see.
So moving the locations of prophecies, sacred events, even the past lives of figures like the Buddha. It's a way to control the narrative.
It's an essential tool for systemizing religion. Think about it. If the ultimate spiritual authority, whether it's the Buddha's past life or the future avatar Kalki, is anchored way off on some island.
It weakens the claim of the central religious authorities. It takes away their direct line to the source.
Precisely. It's a quiet rewriting of divine geography, like swapping out the spiritual coordinates with the mythological sleight of hand.
But the land itself, the actual place,
Yeah.
it resists that kind of editing. The real energy, the original thread, might still be humming away in Lanka. Okay, let's dive right in. Imagine this. What if some of the biggest mysteries we have, Atlantis, the Great Flood, even where the Buddha actually lived and taught, what if they weren't all separate stories? What if they all trace back to just one single place that's still around today?
It's a fascinating premise, and today we're really going deep into some sources that, honestly, they challenge a lot of what we think we know about history, about geography, even spirituality. We're looking at this unified idea that Sri Lanka, the island we know today, is actually the surviving mountain peak of a massive lost continent.
Atalanka.
Atalanka, right. And it goes way beyond just redrawing ancient maps, doesn't it? It's about the people who survived, the Helayo, who they really were, maybe the original Asuras, and then this really startling idea that the Buddha's path, his whole life story, actually happened right there on that peak. Exactly. And to really get our heads around this, we need to look at it from a few angles. Archaeologically, what's the evidence for a sunken landmass? Spiritually, what does this mean for enlightenment? And maybe crucially, geopolitically and mythologically, why might this whole narrative have been shifted or, well, hidden?
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're following these threads, ancient history, Vedic myths, Buddhist philosophy, all supposedly preserved by these mountain people. Let's get into the sources you've brought together. Where do we start?
Let's start with the land itself. The absolute bedrock claim here is that Sri Lanka isn't, well, just an island nation. It's presented as the literal highest point, the summit, of a huge sunken continent, sometimes called Atalanka, sometimes Kumari Kandam. You even see connections drawn to Lemuria.
Okay, Atalanka, and we're talking vast, right?
Yeah.
How big are these sources suggesting it was?
Immense. Think about this. The descriptions map it stretching basically from near Madagascar all the way across the Indian Ocean, maybe towards Australia. It's a truly massive piece of submerged real estate we're talking about.
Wow, so Sri Lanka is just the tip of the iceberg, or I guess the tip of the mountain range in this case.
Precisely. It's the highest elevation that managed to stay above water when the rest went under. The peak, the summit.
And that geography, that survival, is baked right into the name of the people who live there, the Helayo.
Exactly. Hila, in the ancient language, means mountain or peak or summit. So the Helayo, they are quite literally the mountain people. Their name is a kind of living record of surviving that cataclysm on the highest ground. People of the summit.
But this wasn't just some primitive tribe clinging to a mountaintop. The sources describe Atalanka as incredibly advanced, technologically speaking, like almost unbelievably so.
Oh, absolutely. The picture painted is of a civilization with extraordinary engineering capabilities. They talk about two main energy sources, both highly sophisticated. First, harnessing vibrational energy crystals. These weren't just decorative. They were functional, tapping into the Earth's own energy fields, maybe telluric currents or Schumann resonances. This powered everything, including, remarkably, their flying craft. They had these advanced aerial vehicles called the Denchumanara.
Denchumanarian, often translated as the peacock chariot, right? How did those work?
They apparently used a combination of that crystal energy and their second major power source, the sun, harnessing solar power in a very direct, advanced way. The description suggests some kind of anti-gravity or maybe electromagnetic field manipulation, allowing these craft to fly efficiently and sustainably. These were people who really understood energy on a fundamental level. Astronomers, engineers.
Okay, so you have this amazing sun-powered, crystal-based civilization on this huge continent. What could possibly take that down? You mentioned it wasn't sudden.
Right, the sources are quite specific. It wasn't an overnight disaster like an asteroid. It was slow, methodical, and devastating, the Great Flood, but experienced differently. Ah, okay. Because the Helayo story of the flood sounds very different from, say, Noah's flood or the Epic of Gilgamesh version.
And this difference in perspective is absolutely crucial. The sources say the catastrophe was this non-stop torrential rain that lasted for 7 years. 7 years of continuous rain. It slowly filled the lowlands, yes, but crucially, it permanently raised global sea levels, causing the continent to submerge gradually from the south, apparently.
7 years. So if the water is rising slowly but steadily for that long, how does that change the story of the Great Flood we usually hear?
Well, the sources argue that the common myth, the river flood, the sudden deluge, that story comes from the people who were displaced from the lowlands. People who ended up in places like Mesopotamia or Egypt. They experienced water rushing down, rising quickly around them.
But the Helayo, the mountain people, they're already high up. They'd see something different. Exactly. From their vantage point on the peaks, they wouldn't see rivers overflowing in the same way. They'd see the ocean itself just rising, relentlessly encroaching, swallowing the land around their mountain base over those 7 years. So their historical accounts, their memory, is of the sea eating the land. They framed it more like a slow-motion, continent-destroying tsunami, not a flash flood. Same event, totally different experience based on where you were standing.
That perspective shift is really powerful.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, these are enormous claims, a whole sunken continent, crystal cities, flying machines. Beyond the textual sources and myths, is there any mention of, physical evidence? What do the sources point to?
That's the critical question, of course. The sources lean on a couple of main areas. First, they point to findings from modern marine archaeology. Things like submerged structures, potential causeways, unusual underwater formations off the coasts of Sri Lanka and India in the very areas proposed as part of Atalanka. They argue these aren't just natural rock formations, they look structured, man-made.
Okay, so potential underwater ruins. What else?
Second, it's the sheer convergence of flood myths globally. From South America to India to Greece, you find these recurring stories of an advanced civilization destroyed by rising waters. The argument is that when so many disparate cultures tell a similar core story, you have to start wondering if it's reflecting a real, shared, historical event, not just independent invention. The volume of smoke suggests a fire, essentially.
And that 7-year period of rain, that also gives a reason why their amazing technology basically collapsed, even for the survivors on the peak.
Yes, it was the Achilles heel. 7 straight years of thick clouds and rain meant their sun-dependent crystal energy grid was completely starved. It just stopped working. And the geological shifts happening probably disrupted the Earth energy resonances they relied on, too.
So the tech failed them right when they needed it most. I can see how that would lead to abandoning it.
Exactly. Imagine relying utterly on this super advanced tech, and then it just fails during the apocalypse. The sources suggest the survivors felt almost betrayed by it. Their focus snapped entirely to basic survival agriculture, simpler tools, things that were robust and didn't depend on clear skies or stable ground. That advanced knowledge didn't vanish overnight, but it became hidden, esoteric, maybe preserved by a select few, eventually fading into what the rest of the world saw only as myth.
And those survivors who made it, clinging to that peak, which became Sri Lanka, what happened to them next?
They effectively entered a long period of isolation, cut off from the rest of the world, which was itself in chaos rebuilding, fighting over resources. But this isolation, according to the sources, was key. It allowed the Helayo society to survive relatively intact, preserving the core philosophical and maybe even some of the scientific legacy of their ancestors. And it was this unique environment, peaceful, isolated, focused inward, that created the conditions, the sources claim, for the ultimate flowering of human potential, the emergence of the Gautama Buddha.
Okay, so the story of Atalanka is tied up with who ruled it. The people of the Sun Lineage, the Ra Vana. This sounds like it takes us straight into Vedic myth, and specifically the figure of Ra Vana. But our sources say he wasn't the villain we usually hear about.
Right. The narrative here is that the Atlanteans, the Helayo, identified as the Ra Vana, the Sun Lineage.
Yeah.
This wasn't just one king named Ra Vana, it was a dynasty. Powerful rulers traced back through figures like Bali, Tharu, Ravulu. The name itself is key. Ra means sun, Vana means lineage or dynasty, people of the sun.
And you mentioned this connects globally to Egypt, for instance, and Thoth.
Yes, this is a really interesting connection the sources draw. They suggest the name Ra, the sun god in Egypt, isn't coincidental. It's linked directly to the last major ruler of Atalanka, whose name was Ravulu. So when Atlantean survivors like the figure known as Thoth supposedly migrated to places like Egypt after the flood, they brought that solar tradition with them. It's why the Egyptian pharaohs claimed descent from the sun god. They were inheriting the legacy of the Ra Vana from the sunken homeland.
And the mountain Thoth supposedly recorded his knowledge on in the Emerald Tablets.
The sources proposed that wasn't some metaphorical place. It was the surviving peak of Atalanka, what we now call Sri Lanka. It only looked like an island from the perspective of those in the lowlands or arriving by sea. Thoth was, in this view, chronicling the wisdom of the civilization that originated on that very summit.
Now let's tackle that loaded term, Asura. The sources claim Sri Lankans, especially in Ra Vana's time, were known as Asuras, and that this was a title of respect, not condemnation. That's a major revision.
It's absolutely fundamental to understanding this perspective. The way these sources define Asura is critical. It means someone who is not born divine, not Asura or Deva who has divinity inherently, but someone who achieves godlike power or status through their own efforts, through intellect, spiritual discipline, mastering knowledge and capabilities. And to show how deep this kind of revision might go, we need to look even further back than the Puranas. We need to go to the foundational texts.
The Rigveda.
The Rigveda, the oldest voice in this whole tradition. And what do we find there?
It's centered on elemental deities, right?
Yeah.
Varuna, Indra, Soma, Agni.
Exactly. Vishnu. He's there, but he's not the primary dominant figure we think of today. The whole focus was much more elemental, cosmic, not neatly packaged into a system.
So how did Vishnu become so central?
Well, it seems to have been a gradual process over centuries. This phenomenon we could call the Vishnu absorption. Yeah. During the Brahmanical shift towards consolidating the Trimurti Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva Vishnu, gradually absorbed the qualities, the roles, even the stories of some of these earlier, more elemental deities.
And the key one for our discussion today is Varuna.
Definitely Varuna, because originally Varuna wasn't just some sea god. He was the keeper of Raita.
Okay, let's unpack Raita. It's more than just order, isn't it?
Oh, much more. Raita is the fundamental principle of universal order, cosmic law, truth itself. It actually predates the later concept of dharma, which became more about moral and social duties.
So Varuna was in charge of the fabric of reality.
In a sense, yes. He governed the laws of nature, the movements of the stars, the moral order that held everything together. He was this immense, universal overseer associated with the deep, unseen truths, the hidden karmic workings of the cosmos, way beyond just water.
So when Vishnu became the preserver in the Trinity,
he essentially took over Varuna's massive portfolio as the keeper of cosmic law. Varuna's domain got gradually shrunk down, reduced mainly to oceans and water bodies.
to make way for the new, more convenient, systematized Trinity.
Exactly, it fitted the new structure. But it wasn't necessarily reflecting the original elemental understanding found in the Rigveda.
So this pattern, shifting powerful deities, rewriting locations, emphasizing systems over raw elemental truth, it all suggests that maybe the most fundamental truths about where spiritual authority really lies
Might still be preserved more intact in the regional lore of places like Lanka, places where maybe that original narrative wasn't quite so thoroughly overwritten by the later dominant systems.
Fascinating. It really makes you rethink the foundations. Okay, so the oldest texts point to elemental gods like Varuna, and the whole Vishnu narrative was maybe layered on later. That brings us to Lanka's own guardian deity.
Right, because the source material we looked at makes a strong point. The Buddhist chronicles, like the Mahavamsa, the island's own historical record.
They never said Vishnu was the guardian.
They never originally positioned Vishnu as the island's divine protector. That seems to be an imported idea, something retrofitted over time.
How did that happen? Influence from South India.
Yeah, heavily influenced by South Indian Vaishnavism and probably later reinforced by colonial scholars who tended to map local deities onto Hindu figures they already knew. Misidentification, syncretism, it happens.
So if it wasn't Vishnu originally, who was the indigenous guardian, the source mentioned Anila Purusha.
Yes, the blue being. Local lore speaks of this figure as the island's silent, watchful, protective presence.
And as Nila Purusha is identified as.
Upolvindevi, the blue lotus-hued deity, revered locally as this peaceful washer, embodying a kind of ethereal, watery stillness.
So the connection was the color blue, because Vishnu is also depicted as blue.
That seems to be the key link. It made it really easy for later syncretists, people trying to blend traditions, to just map Vishnu onto Upolvindevi. Keep the role island guardian, but change the face.
Spiritual Photoshop, like you said earlier, making the imported guide feel native by linking him to the familiar blue watcher.
Exactly. But if you peel back those later Vishnu layers, who emerges as the logical original protector given everything we've discussed about the Rigveda? Varuna. the original keeper of cosmic law, Rita, the master of the oceanic depths. His energy aligns perfectly with that watcher archetype of Upulvan.
A seer who knows and preserves the deep order.
Rather than a forceful king who actively rules or intervenes constantly. Varuna's domain is the ocean, the stability of cosmic order, the deep subconscious. It's a perfect fit for an island nation completely surrounded by his element.
So Lanka's guardianship wasn't about conquest or ruling.
It was about presence, awareness,
Right.
preserving hidden law, which are Varuna's exact immense attributes before he got demoted, essentially.
Okay, and this connects directly to the blue lotus symbol, right? The Nila Utpala. That's literally Upulvan Devi's color.
Yes. We really need to explore this symbol, its connection to cosmic waters.
Even if there isn't a direct text saying Varuna Blue Lotus in the later Puranas.
The symbolic link feels inescapable when you consider Varuna's original primordial function.
How so?
Varuna represents the deep, still cosmic waters, the vast, stable, often dark abyss from which creation arises, and the blue lotus. What does it love?
Still water, calm water.
Still, cool water, stability. And philosophically, it symbolizes wisdom, transcendence, clarity rising out of the depths, out of darkness. It emerges pure, untouched by the mud below.
Which mirrors Varuna's role as the seer of unseen karmic order, seeing the truth beneath the surface.
Precisely. He presides over the hidden laws. So when people offer the blue lotus to a Kulvin, they're offering a flower that embodies stillness, mystic depth, a resonance that aligns perfectly with Varuna's original energy.
And this gets even more specific when we look at the actual flower itself, the botanical reality. The listener emphasized this distinction.
Yes, this is crucial for grounding the myth in the land. We're not talking about the Egyptian blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, which often gets mixed up in New Age circles.
We're talking about the Sri Lankan blue lotus.
Nymphea nuchali, the Nilmanel, which is significantly the national flower of Sri Lanka. It's indigenous, it's everywhere there.
Okay, so Asuras were the ultimate self-made beings, attaining power through knowledge, not birthright. Intellectual giants.
Precisely. It signifies a lineage that valued earned mastery, high intellect, and self-discipline above inherited status. They challenged the idea of innate divinity by reaching that level through their own work, which, if you think about it, fits perfectly with the description of a highly advanced engineered civilization like Atalanka.
And this positive view of Asura, it actually shows up in the really old Hindu text, right?
Yes, and that's a key piece of corroborating evidence cited. In the oldest parts of the Vedas, particularly the Rigveda, the term Asura is often used to mean powerful, mighty, sovereign. It carried weight and respect. Devas and Asuras weren't initially portrayed as automatically enemies. Varuna, Indra, Agni, many major early figures were called Asura. The idea of Asuras being inherently demonic, that's largely a later development, more prominent in the Puranas, suggesting a shift in politics or theology down the line.
To really nail down the original status of Asuras, the sources highlight one figure in particular, Varuna, an undeniably ancient, powerful deity explicitly called an Asura.
Varuna is absolutely central. He's one of the oldest, most revered deities in the Rigveda, often seen as the supreme sovereign in the earliest layers, Lord of the Sky, Lord of Waters, Chief of the Adityas. And yes, the texts explicitly call him an Asura, especially when mentioned alongside Mitra. They are the great Asuras, the sovereigns.
What was Varuna's main job? What defined his power as this mighty Asura?
Varuna's core role, his defining characteristic, is being the guardian of Sutta. And Asta is a huge concept. It's more than just truth or order. It's the fundamental cosmic law, the operating system of the universe. It governs everything, the sun rising, the rivers flowing, the seasons changing, but also moral law, justice, the right way of things.
So Asta is like the underlying code of reality.
Exactly. And Varuna is its guardian, its administrator. He's called Atasyagopa, the shepherd of Vata. He upholds the cosmic and natural laws, vratas, ensuring things run correctly. He oversees oaths, punishes falsehood, maintains balance. His power comes from understanding and enforcing this fundamental order. It's about intellectual sovereignty over the cosmos, not just brute force. He is Nithavrata, the one whose command is fixed.
Okay, seeing Varuna like that as the ultimate guardian of cosmic law completely changes how we read his famous encounter with Sri Rama in the Ramayana.
It really does. Remember the story. Rama needs to cross the sea to Lanka. He prays to the sea king, Varuna, who refuses him passage for 3 days. The sources argue this wasn't Varuna being difficult or siding with Ra Vana out of malice.
It was him doing his job, protecting his domain.
Precisely. As Tasya Gopa, Lord of the Waters, Varuna was bound by cosmic law to protect the integrity of the ocean. Just letting an army cross, especially to attack Lanka, the heartland of the powerful Ra Vana lineage, possibly under his distant jurisdiction, could be seen as a violation of Atta, disrupting the natural order. He was defending his realm's sovereignty, upholding the rules against Rama. He only relents when Rama threatens to destroy the ocean itself with his divine weapons, which would have been an even greater violation of cosmic order.
That's fascinating. So the whole story actually reinforces Varuna's status as a powerful, law-abiding Asura, not a demon. He's the ultimate upholder of order, which fits perfectly with the idea that the Sri Lankan lineage he was, in a way, protecting was also one defined by intellect and sovereign power. Okay, so if the Helayo on this isolated peak were the descendants of this intellectually advanced, sovereign Asura lineage, their society would have been, well, different, primed for something unique.
That's the link the sources make. That very isolation, the enforced peace after the cataclysm, it turned their focus inward. While other parts of the world were caught up in rebuilding, wars, migrations, the Helayo had the chance to cultivate deep introspection, philosophical inquiry, and maintain that ancient intellectual rigor. It created, as the sources put it, the perfect spiritual crucible for the highest possible human achievement, the arising of a Buddha.
Which brings us to probably the most explosive claim in these sources, that the historical Buddha, Gautama, didn't live and teach in India and Nepal as tradition holds, but right there in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Let's start with the Buddha's own instructions about his pilgrimage sites.
Right, the Chaturamani. According to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha told his attendant Ananda that 4 specific places associated with his life should be visited by the faithful. And crucially, the sources emphasize a detail often overlooked. He specified they should be arranged in a straight line at equal distances. That geometric instruction is key.
And the traditional sites, Lumbini for birth, Bodh Gaya for enlightenment, Sarnath for the first sermon, Kushinagar for his passing, they just don't fit that geometry.
Not at all. If you plot them on a map, they form a kind of scattered rhombus or quadrilateral. The distances are very unequal, and they're nowhere near being in a straight line. It completely contradicts the geometric specification.
Okay, but the alternative sites proposed in Sri Lanka Hirvaduna, Isenbasagala, Budangala, Kandy, these supposedly do line up.
The claim is it suggests a level of sophisticated geographical and possibly astronomical planning that's hard to dismiss as coincidence. Aligning sacred sites perfectly perpendicular to the equator implies knowledge of global coordinates, maybe using solar observations, or even Earth's magnetic fields. It connects the sites to the fundamental structure of the planet itself. Achieving that kind of precision randomly, especially with the widely scattered Indian sites, seems astronomically unlikely.
Beyond the geometry, there's also the simple practicality of pilgrimage back then.
Absolutely. The sheer distances involved in traveling between Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, and Kushinagar in ancient times would have been immense. A difficult, dangerous, and time-consuming journey for anyone, let alone ordinary followers. It seems almost counterintuitive for sites meant to inspire the masses. The proposed Sri Lankan configuration, however, is much more compact, geographically accessible within the island. It fits the idea of widespread pilgrimage much more logically.
So if the geography was potentially altered or misrepresented, what about the purpose of visiting these sites? The sources challenge the common understanding there too, right?
They do. The Buddha tells Ananda to visit these places so that devotees might experience Samvega, often translated today as stirring emotion, sadness, or even mourning. But the sources argue this translation is deeply problematic, especially when viewed through the lens of core Buddhist philosophy, like the Abhidharma.
Why problematic?
Because Abhidharma meticulously categorizes mental states. And sadness, grief, lamentation, these are all forms of aversion or attachment. They're considered unwholesome mental factors, kilesas, hindrances to clarity and liberation. The Buddha dedicated his entire teaching to overcoming such states. So the idea that he would instruct followers to deliberately cultivate sadness at his most sacred sites seems like a fundamental contradiction. Why encourage a mental defilement?
Okay, so if it wasn't about feeling sad or mourning, what was the original intention behind visiting the Chaturamani, according to this alternative view?
The interpretation preserved in the Helayo tradition, allegedly, is that these sites were meant to be portals for realization. Places specifically chosen or consecrated, perhaps due to the events that happened there or their energetic properties, where practitioners could more easily cultivate deep awareness, mindfulness, and gain insight. They were meant to resonate with the Buddha's enlightenment energy, too, and facilitate the visitor's own path. The argument is the meaning got twisted from places for awakening to places for mourning, effectively obscuring their true function.
This is fascinating. But we need more than just textual interpretation and geographical alignment. What about physical evidence? You mentioned the Chinese pilgrim Fa Hin earlier.
Yes, Fa Hin's journey in the early 5th century CE is crucial. He traveled extensively to what he called Buddha's land to collect texts and accounts. While traditionally assumed to be India, the sources point to a major discrepancy. The specific, highly venerated relics Fa Hin described seeing, he explicitly mentions Buddha's walking stick, Prince Siddhartha's sword from his renunciation, the Urnapuria, the forehead curl or jewel spot, and critically, the Buddha's actual alms bowl.
And where are those specific, unique items historically kept?
Well, the walking stick might be debatable, but the royal sword Siddhartha cast off in the original alms bowl, these have undeniable, long-standing historical traditions connecting them firmly to Sri Lanka, particularly Anuradhapura and Kandy. It begs the question, if the main events happened in India, why were these primary personal relics of the Buddha housed and venerated hundreds of miles away in Sri Lanka when Fa Hin visited? He saw the key relics where the sources claim the events actually happened.
Okay, but the standard rebuttal to the Sri Lanka theory regarding Fa Hin is always, he never mentioned crossing a major body of water to get to Buddha's land. If he went to Sri Lanka, surely he'd mention the sea voyage.
This is where the historical geography of the land bridge, the Ramasetu or Adams Bridge, becomes the linchpin. The sources argue that, based on historical records and even maps from around Fa Hin's time, Ramasetu wasn't the broken chain of islets we see today. It was likely a contiguous, walkable land corridor, maybe as much as 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point.
3 kilometers wide. So walking across...
Well, it wouldn't feel like a sea crossing requiring a boat. It would just feel like walking across a low-lying stretch of land, maybe marshy in places, but fundamentally a land route. So Fa Hin could have walked from the Indian mainland to Sri Lanka without perceiving it as a significant sea journey worth detailing in his logs. This potentially neutralizes the main objection to him having visited Sri Lanka as Buddha's land. The sea hadn't fully reclaimed the bridge yet.
Interesting. Are there other clues? Linguistic or cultural hints?
A couple of subtle points are raised. One is the use of the word Dvipa. In standard Indian cosmology, Dvipa usually refers to huge continents or island realms within the cosmos. But ancient Sri Lankan inscriptions apparently use Dvipa to designate regions within Sri Lanka itself, like Heladvipa for the central mountain area, Nagadvipa for the north. This unique, localized usage might suggest an isolated worldview where their own land was seen as encompassing these continental divisions.
And the language of the scriptures.
The point made is about the Pali Canon, the Tripitaka, the core texts of Theravada Buddhism. The oldest surviving complete versions were first written down, committed to script, in Sri Lanka, using the Sinhala script around the 1st century BCE at Aluvihar. While Pali was likely spoken across regions, the fact that Sri Lanka became the crucial center for its written preservation, using their own stable script while Indian scripts were rapidly evolving, underscores its role not just as a recipient of Buddhism, but potentially its historical and linguistic anchor.
Lastly, let's loop back to that idea of kingship. The prophecy about Siddhartha becoming either a world ruler or a Buddha.
Yes, the Chakravartin, the universal monarch archetype. The sources argue this prophecy makes even more sense in a Sri Lankan context. Why? Because Sri Lanka, through the legacy of the Ra Vana and the Asura lineage, supposedly had this deep-seated cultural memory and aspiration of global sovereignty, of immense power derived from knowledge, a heritage arguably less pronounced in the fragmented kingdoms of northern India at the time.
So the idea of choosing between ruling the entire world or achieving enlightenment had a stronger cultural resonance there.
Exactly. It frames the Buddha's choice not just as rejecting a local kingdom, but rejecting a potential global empire rooted in this ancient, powerful lineage. Choosing liberation over the ultimate expression of that sovereign power becomes an even more profound statement, deeply resonant with the island's alleged history. So when we pull all these threads together from this deep dive, what we've really seen is this profound potential recentering of spiritual authority.
Away from the usual places.
Yeah, suggesting that the true cradle of prophecy, of dharma, maybe even the real story of the final avatar, it might often be found not in those huge, centralized, mainstream texts we always rely on,
but in the local stuff. The resilient, often overlooked lore and the actual geography of places like Lanka.
Exactly, and the power of remembering that original narrative, thinking about Jyotipala being in Dambadi, Varuna perhaps being the original guardian, reflected in Apulvan Devi, it's fundamentally transformative.
Because it reclaims a kind of suppressed spiritual authorship.
Precisely. It affirms that maybe the island itself holds the original spiritual coordinates, the ones that got overwritten or shifted elsewhere.
And it makes sense then that the external transformations we saw in the listener's story, the hair mirroring the fierce consort, fixing the astral cloak car, creating that powerful music.
They're never accidental, are they? They always seem to reflect an internal mythic alignment that happens when you genuinely reconnect with your ancestral land and embrace that true heritage. And that brings us back, connecting to the source material one last time, to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away.
Okay.
The material we explored today really demonstrates something powerful. When you start vibrating at your true frequency, your authentic resonance. When that happens, the cosmic forces around you, all those things people chase or get anxious about, they're not things you pursue. They start rotating towards you. Whether it's a specific astrological pattern or even something as seemingly mundane as financial investments, those external things tend to naturally align themselves once the internal frequency is sovereign, integrated, and true.
So the final question for you is, what's sacred geography in your own life?
Maybe the overlooked corners, the mundane spots that show quiet resilience. What parts of your world are you currently ignoring?
That might be waiting right now to send you a direct, unfiltered message.
The deep dive is complete.
Go forth and find your nil mantle. We'll talk to you next time.